This outcome is part of the findings of the research project Spatial Justice in Times of Urban Transition, SITO Transitions. Our research from August 2017 till November 2020 was funded by the UK's Department for International Development through its East Africa Research Fund. In order to understand how complex urban land markets influence spatial justice within the current urban transition in East Africa, we studied 4 cities in Uganda and Somaliland as and within integrated systems of given political economies.
In this video, we'll be presenting our views on what spatial justice is. These are reflections by some members of the project team and represent work in progress. The views that are presented here emerge from a key concern in our project, looking at the role of land markets in the context of urban transitions and in relation to spatial justice. You may be wondering why it is that we are devoting this video to a reflection on what spatial justice is. After all, it is commonly accepted that spatial justice highlights the spatial elements of a just society, and thus obvious elements are the uneven ways in which resources are distributed in cities. Obvious examples are the way that services are fragmented, or the ways that certain groups of people appear confined to specific parts of the city. And then power and privilege to be able to create a livable, sustainable, and urban space is unevenly distributed. And because we understand space as constituted by social practices and meanings and social practices to be constituted by space, we can also draw attention to the procedural and processual dimensions of spatial justice, about who is even heard in claims for justice. And then we can certainly see lots of inequality in cities like Arua, Kampala, Berbera or Hargeysa, and many other cities in the world. Such cities appear very fragmented, with haphazard planning and definite patterns of where people land up and what they can do about this. In this common view, the role of land markets is fairly widely agreed upon too. Land markets are the cause of much spatial injustice. They discriminate against the poor and give the wealthy an advantage because the amount of resources people have define what they can do in a market. They also unequally distribute access to the most well-located, favorable land, and in terms of quantity too, because these qualities are valued more highly. They discriminate against the poor behind the myth that everyone is free to do what they want, when in actual fact they cannot, and hence satisfy their needs within their resources. On the face of it then, land markets must be a key contributor to the spatial injustices we see in such cities. However, there are 3 key issues to note that hold such a common view together. The first is that spatial justice is the same anywhere. The second, that the land markets that operate in these cities conform to a neoclassical economic model of demand and supply for land, interacting to set prices, which in turn shapes land use behavior and thus discriminate against the poor. And third, that this common view has well-developed roots in Eurocentric and Anglophone knowledge, even if it is also expressed by many analysts and policymakers from the Global South. In other words, who the we is in the story, who is doing the observing, analyzing, and interpreting, needs to be acknowledged for the positionalities that comes with this. If all 3 of these issues are revisited, then the relationships between land markets and spatial justice become more difficult to discern, at least in terms of the causality that's suggested. Spatial justice can mean different things in different cities, and if land markets operate with logics other than that supposed by neoclassical economics, if different vantage points on what spatial justice is have equal weight, then assumptions about what cities are, how spatial justice unfolds, and who can identify what spatial justice is, proliferates. and this proliferates how the relationships between land markets and spatial justice can be understood. Now, it's important to note that we're not saying that profit-making, self-interested transactions don't happen and cause immiseration, but we are saying that this is not all that happens. In our project, we started with the conventional view of spatial justice that I've just described, and we found it very difficult to work with because it offered little purchase on the dynamics the research revealed. We came to the view that the Eurocentric view of spatial justice should not be understood to have the same relevance everywhere. And just like many other urban development concepts have been provincialized, it would seem spatial justice should be too. In order to do this, we worked with an understanding of land markets that allows for the co-presence of many different logics and for actors to occupy multiple positions. We realized that people's experiences of spatial injustice varies at an individual level as well as what it might mean across the different cities, because the same people can simultaneously occupy multiple roles in land markets, and thus, while they might be disadvantaged in one role, they can be advantaged in another. And transactions within land markets can be disaggregated at individual and city levels, and that these transactions can be positive and negative for individuals and cities at the same time, thereby making it extremely difficult to judge which is the most consequential. With this in mind, let's consider the different responses to the question, what is spatial justice to you?
So what was spatial justice to me? Well, my role in the project was undertaking a spatial assessment of each of our 4 case study cities, so where we looked at the physical form of each city and how that changed over time. And from that, you got a very immediate sense of how equitable or just market outcomes had been, land market outcomes, thinking in terms of spatial justice. So it's easy looking, say, at the city of Kampala, that there's wide variation in the way that households in particular access land, how much land they were able to access and in which locations and with which specific qualities. So you could see quite clearly one neighbourhood, large houses on large plots, compared to a neighbourhood a few streets over where there's lots of households crammed together in very basic accommodation. This gives you a kind of quite immediate sense of what spatial justice means for that city, where there's differences in the way that people are able to access land to meet their needs or preferences.
Here, Martin is reminding us that any discussion of spatial justice must be anchored in spatial phenomena themselves, and that the cities we engaged with in our research exhibit profound inequalities in what people have and where they have it. Else adds to this view by highlighting how spatial justice is also about power relations, and who has the power to shape space in particular ways.
Following Edward Soja, to me spatial justice is a perspective of analysis to understand justice, where space and location are the focus. Space here is not merely understood in its physical dimension, but in line with the ideas of Henri Lefebvre, something that is produced and reproduced, and so also relates to who has the power to do so. To me, some of the most important features of spatial justice are relativity. I do not believe a state of absolute spatial justice can be achieved or even defined. However, in line with Amartya Sen, it is possible to analyze places and situations in comparison to each other. The criteria for this analysis, however, depend on the context, which I identify as a second feature of spatial justice. While this is different for each individual, there usually are shared societal values, which enable a common understanding to a certain extent. This is important, and I base this insight on Colin's ideas, because I think that in order to be useful for policy making, you need to do this analysis at a higher level, as in the level of the city. You can look at spatial justice at the level of the individual in terms of what everyone's situation is, but the city is more than just the sum of individuals. So it is important to see how the city as an entity is benefiting or losing.
The iterative relation that else highlights opens the possibility to introduce the view I expressed. Spatial justice is a reference point that sits on my moral and political compass. It is a concept that justifies a focus on a particular spatial process and legitimates spatial interventions. My view highlights that spatial justice can work as a normative goal and that it offers criteria for evaluating my own action. In other words, this response is reflective and inward-looking, but it is problematic because it upholds a predetermined universal set of criteria against which to judge action. In a context where we acknowledge the validity and importance of thinking from elsewhere, the view I'm expressing here appears as a constraint. All the other responses identify a normative element, but Dorcas challenges the universality head-on and calls for the acknowledgement of spatial justice being unique in each city.
To me, spatial justice is a concept that cannot be generalized or even understood in simplistic subjectivity. It is unique in every context, and this means that it differs within and between cities. I find that spatial justice is not an endpoint, but rather a process that is ultimately guided by principles of equity and fairness, extended especially to the poor, the disabled, and other vulnerable groups that live among us.
Alex elaborates on the normative element by drawing attention to issues of fairness and pushes this further by suggesting that one way of getting to notions of spatial justice is through engaging with people's experiences of living in a city.
To me, spatial justice is the experience of fairness in regards to one's location in space. That is, in other words, a location that provides me with my basic needs and the requirements for my life. And also provides me access or approachability of the services, opportunities, and other social requirements that I would have, that I need to reach. So there should be a connection. In other words, spatial justice is composed of different social and spatial layers that can be either seen and defined from the location itself towards other parts in the city, or it can also be understood as a network of connecting features where my specific location is part of.
Alex notes that spatial justice is extremely complex to get to grips with, and that one way of approaching the analysis of spatial justice might be through thinking about it in terms of layers. Like Alex, Michael also focuses on fairness being an important feature of spatial justice.
Spatial justice, in my mind, is about the fairness of people's access to important resources, both social and physical, within a particular urban area. So, for example, how accessible are basic needs to people's homes, say clean water, sanitation facilities, schools and affordable food outlets. That'll differ from neighborhood to neighborhood and also from household to household. And of course, I think we can assume that the better off a household is, the better will be their access to those basic needs. So it means that the justice aspect of spatial justice can really be distilled down to: do the poorest households in a particular urban area have reasonable access to basic needs, and how much do levels of access differ across the town or city in question?
Here, Michael stresses that, for him, spatial justice implies that there's a minimum level of basic needs that must be met. This is interesting in that it equates spatial justice with a guarantee of how equitably basic needs should be met in the present, rather than looking ahead. In my view, This is slightly different and perhaps slightly more pragmatic and immediate than a notion of corrective justice which seeks to address historical injustice, as important as this might also be. Jama Musa Jama reinforces points made by Else that spatial justice is a process and that it is difficult to use a snapshot view to get a sense of what it is. He also references Dorcas that spatial justice is located in the ongoing processes that have their own questions of justice associated with them.
Because of my understanding of spatial justice, meaning also to be aware of geographical aspects of injustice to access to the land and to share both the bad and the benefits of urbanization with the neighborhoods. I endorsed this project from the initial, both as a researcher and on behalf of the organization I work for here in Hargeysa, Somaliland.
But Jama also makes another critical point, that spatial justice is not just about correcting or sharing what currently exists, but also imagining about the equity of the potential, sometimes called the urban dividend, that is to come if urban transitions can be steered in more equitable directions. The what can be if urbanization is thought beyond the redistribution of current services, pipes, roads, houses, and amenities, to the potential that emerges from thinking collectively beyond the current city. The potential resources for thinking about spatial justice that remain as yet untapped and unrealized. And hence, the need to lift our horizons and to look for inspiration in art, music, and as Michael and Alex have observed, in the collective experiences of what can be. Let me try and take stock then. We started the video with the observation that spatial injustice seems quite obvious in cities like Arua, Kampala, Berbera and Hargeysa. And yet, maybe it is that fragmented land uses, haphazard planning, and unequal opportunities to create a sustainable livelihood in cities matter. But maybe they matter in different ways to spatial justice than what is currently presumed by those in urban development planning. It is evident that a concept like spatial justice, far from being isolated from other concepts and driving interpretations of other urban phenomena, is heavily reliant on and invested in the meanings of other terms. Dorcas has drawn attention to how we need to relate to the local specificities of the processes. Alex draws attention to concepts of fairness and experiences. Martin to the physical and spatial locational dimensions. Michael to standards and the basic needs that need to be guaranteed. And Else draws attention to power relations. Finally, Jama drew attention to the resources offered by tapping into the potential of the city to come. And recognizing and working with this interdependence of meaning perhaps provides an opening to the generation of local, city-level understandings of spatial justice. By tracking the importance of local terms and local interpretations of phenomena related to spatial justice, it would be possible to develop local understandings that have political weight. These are our interpretations, and there will have to be more. This is what spatial justice is for us for the moment, but we need to engage in collective conversations to develop a fuller, more inclusive account, and our reflections are merely a staging point. Indeed, by collectively unlocking spatial justice from its own conceptual and philosophical grid, we might do justice to spatial justice in cities in the global south.